Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for June the 7th, 2021. Hope you're doing well this day. So let's jump right on into our text. We've got Deuteronomy chapter 11, Psalm 95 and 96, then Isaiah 39. Both Deuteronomy 11 and Isaiah 39 are ends of certain sections of those books, central sections of those books, I guess you could say. And then finally, Revelation chapter 9. So why don't we start with Deuteronomy 11? So if you remember, Deuteronomy can be conceived of in several ways. First of all, we should conceive of it as Moses's final words. This adds a sense of urgency to the text as he is preparing the Israelites to enter into the promised land without him. Then we can conceive of them as sermonic on the part of Moses. Don't see them primarily as legal documents, but as Moses exhorting the people of Israel towards covenant obedience. And then finally, we can conceive of Deuteronomy as a covenant document itself in the way it's structured, that you have these central elements or these essential elements of covenant documents in the ancient world. And Deuteronomy pretty much follows those that structure that was very common in the ancient Near East of treaty documents. And so this is a covenant or a treaty document of God with his people. But if you're looking at the structure as a series of sermons, scholars have divided the book up into either 3 or 4 sermons on the part of Moses, the central one being chapters around chapter 5 through 26. And you could divide that further into chapter 5 through 11. That's really the central thrust of the book of Deuteronomy. Chapters 5 through 11, which of course contain, for instance, the Shema in Deuteronomy 6, the restatement of the 10 words, the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy 5. And then finally here in this last chapter of that central section of Deuteronomy, again, exhortative, sermonic types of material. Here Moses is offering them a final exhortation, and he does so in a way that's very common in covenant documents. The Israelites had a choice as they followed God in covenant relationship once they got into the promised land. And their choice was between 2 things: following God in blessing or not following God and cursing. Blessing was in ancient covenant documents was a way in which God would enforce or encourage covenant obedience. We see this in Leviticus 26. We've seen it already. We see it in Deuteronomy 28 later on. We see it in Deuteronomy 32 even. But here in Deuteronomy 11, we see this being actually spelled out in verse 26. I'm setting before you today blessing and cursing. The cursing, by the way, was things like plague, pestilence, sword, famine, that were means by which God would enforce the covenant in a negative way, right? So if the Israelites disobeyed, these types of things would come upon the Israelites as a means of disciplining them as a people. And we will see this throughout the prophets, these different covenant blessings and cursings. And they are the way to understand, I think, the prophetic message, because the prophets were covenant lawyers and covenant maybe that's covenant enforcers might be a better term for that, right? That they were God's messengers of the covenant. And here we have Moses, though, starting that idea and that tradition here in Deuteronomy, and basically says you have these 2 choices: blessing and cursing. You have obedience to the covenant, in other words, or disobedience to the covenant. If you choose obedience, if you listen to the commandments that the Lord your God has commanded you today, then and do them, listening is not just hearing, but is doing them, then you will bring blessing on yourself. And if you disobey, if you do not listen, turn aside and follow after other gods, basically turning aside typically meant going after other gods, engaging in idolatry, then of course they would experience God's cursing and God's discipline as a people. God disciplines those he loves, and he disciplined his people that he loved in the Old Testament as well. So here we have how I think God takes the covenant seriously and takes the obedience of God's covenant people seriously here in Deuteronomy. So let's move on to Psalm 95 and 96. So in these 2 chapters, these 2 Psalms, We are in the heart of that section of Psalms that we entitled the kind of the Yahweh Malak Psalms that are celebrating God's enthronement, God's kingship. We see that in Psalm 95, for instance, where it talks about God um, as our great King, verse 3. And then, of course, in Psalm 96, this is typically seen by scholars as kind of an enthronement type of psalm, celebrating God on his throne, and worshiping God as the righteous judge. But of course, as a judge, he would be, that's a kingly role in the ancient Near East. And what the psalmist is inviting is the praise of God. And this praise, of course, not only extends to God's people whom he is king over, but it extends over all of creation and all the nations. And so he is exhorting all the earth, verse 1 of Psalm 96, to praise this great king. All the peoples, verse 7, are to ascribe to the Lord that which is due to him, the glory and strength and the glory of his name. But I think one of my favorite pictures in this is in Psalm 96, verses 11, where we have 11 and following, where we have the personification, as the psalmist often does, of the earth and all that it contains, the earth and the sea and whatever is within it. So these created elements are doing what? Well, they are singing for joy, exulting in their creator. And they are setting the example for us as his created beings as well. And again, God is king because he is the creator. He is sovereign because he has created all things. The other thing that I love about these two psalms is in Psalm 95, we have what's called the technical term is a lead advert. It's a leading word in the text. And you could probably pick this out depending on whatever translation you're using. But in Psalm 95 in verse 4, 5, and 7, we have this repeated word of hand. So it has what we would call an anthropomorphism, God being portrayed as having human form, human morphism form. So God having a human form here in a way that helps us to understand something about the character of God. And what does it say? Well, in whose hand are the depths of the earth. And again, hand, if you have something in your hand, you control it. So it's speaking of God's sovereignty. He created it, he controls it. And the depths of the earth, even those places that are hard to control for us, that are symbolic of chaos and darkness and an inability for us to know about it. God knows and God controls. In his hands, he formed all things. So he controls all things. He formed all things with his hands. But here's the beautiful picture. So here's his hand that created and controls. And then the other appearance of hand here comes after this exhortation to kneel before the Lord our maker. The psalmist says that we are the sheep of his hand. That's an interesting expression, isn't it? To think about that we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand, but pictures God in the shepherd imagery, which is of course a kingly image in the ancient Near East as well. But it shows also God's intimate relationship to his people, to us in the New Covenant context. And so the same hand that controls the world, the same hand that guides the world, the same hand that created the world is the same hand that holds us as his people. It's a beautiful picture, isn't it? Let's move on then to Isaiah 39. And again, this is a close of a section of the book of Isaiah. Remember that Isaiah divided up into roughly two sections, Isaiah 1 through 39 and 40 through 66, all written by Isaiah. But the first 39, well, let me take that back. We shouldn't have a hard and fast distinction, but I think there's a clear dividing point here because the Isaiah 40 through 66 does have, though I think it speaks directly to the people of Isaiah's day, it also has a sense of speaking to the people who are experiencing the exile. And Isaiah 39 here is the end of these narratives on Hezekiah. And remember that those narratives are preparing the way, even in the book of Kings and Chronicles, are preparing the way for the exile. Hezekiah is kind of the last straw. Well, really not the last straw. I guess you still have Josiah, who was a good king, to come after him. But pretty much, at least in the book of Kings, everything is spiraling down towards exile from Hezekiah. And even Josiah cannot stem that tide. But here in Isaiah 40, we have, of course, Hezekiah. This is a text again that we'll see in 2 Kings 20. Hezekiah here is he is welcoming visitors from Babylon, ostensibly to congratulate him on his recovery. But of course, remember that Assyria is the ascendant power at this time. Babylonians are not the world power; they will soon be. And Hezekiah is visited then by Isaiah, who says, basically, "What are you doing? You are inviting those who will eventually come in and destroy this nation." And then Hezekiah, who is a good king, does what perhaps we would have done in verse 8. Well, at least it's not going to happen when I'm living. A little bit of the hubris and selfishness of even the greatest king of one of the greatest kings of the Jewish people. Shows, I think, something of Hezekiah's failing, but also remember that the kings were often illustrative, paradigmatic examples of the nation as a whole, the problems facing the nation as a whole. And the nation as a whole desiring, as long as it doesn't happen to us, we're okay with it. But the point is that, we're responsible for our own spiritual health and for the well-being of others that come after us. But of course, Hezekiah, as the representative of the nation, fails. And this, of course, is pointing forward to a king who would not fail his people, the Messianic king, which is a figure that is central to the book of Isaiah. Then finally, Revelation 9. Remember, in Revelation, we're in this section where we have we've had the seals. Now we have the trumpets. All of these are announcing various judgments of God upon the world. And here we have the fifth of the trumpets that come after. They are all kind of connected together. These seals, trumpets, and that signal ultimately and then the bowls that come later that ultimately bring on God's judgment upon the world. And it seems like in Revelation we have several endings as well, and they're all communicating different things about it. But again, the best thing to do with Revelation is to kind of step back and allow the image itself to hit us. So this fifth trumpet is speaking of this devastating judgment that God is going to send. And we have here a star from heaven that's fallen to the earth. Scholars will disagree over who this star is. Some see the star as an angelic being of some sort. Some see it, and I think probably rightly so, that this is the star fallen from heaven. It's almost the exact wording of Luke 10:18, speaking of Satan. But regardless, whoever this person is bringing forth judgment, and the judgment is cast in very much Old Testament imagery here. The locust, for instance, coming out of the book of Joel, but also the book of Exodus. And they are going out and they are bringing death, specifically death to those who are opposing God and his people. And the purpose of all these, and by the way, all this is under the control of God, being given the key, for instance, of the bottomless pit. Well, who has that key? Well, we know from Revelation 1 that it's Christ who has the keys of death and Hades, right? So this is something that is given over, a power that is only derived, or only they only have the ability to do this based on the sovereignty of God. But the ultimate purpose of all these, the fifth and the sixth trumpet, and all the different judgments that are being sent upon the earth, is that they would repent. But of course, even in the midst of this judgment, even in the midst of these disciplinary measures, just like with Israel in the Old Testament with the covenant curses, the people still desire to go after the idols, the works of their hands, and worship the demons and the idols of gold and silver, um, and they did not repent. This is such as the nature of the human condition and the human heart. Exactly what we discussed this past week in Ezekiel 36, where it speaks of the heart of stone. This is us without Christ. And those who experience this judgment, even the judgment itself, does not turn them back to God in these last days, which we're living in. So, interesting images here. If you have questions or comments. I did want to show you this too. I know this is kind of intimidating. This is intimidating for me too. This is a large commentary, but it's probably the best one that's out there. I think I mentioned this before on Revelation. He's got an abridged version of this that's available. This one's fairly expensive. I think I ended up paying $75 for this back when I didn't have $75 to spend on commentaries. But this is a really good one if you really want to get into depth on Revelation. And again, there's an abridged version of that out there if you want to check that out. I'm not sure how much that is, but it's definitely on the lesser expensive end of the spectrum. So anyway, I hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, June 7th, 2021.